Hi, and welcome to number 5 in the podcast series. And this is the first in another series, a sub-series within the series, I guess, called Chinese Australian History in 8 objects, or pieces of 8, as they sometimes call it. Or if you go back to the 88 Objects website, you'll see the Pieces of 8 series. And I've written up 2 of these in booklet forms, or short book forms. And this particular one I'm interested in. So I picked 8, again, as a kind of lucky number within Chinese culture. I picked just 8 examples of what I call Chinese voices. So you'll notice in most of the history, particularly in the 19th century Australian history, we're dependent upon European observers of the Chinese, because the Chinese themselves, Chinese people in Australia, gold miners and other market gardeners, really didn't write a great deal until they began publishing newspapers, Chinese language newspapers, very late in the 19th century, in the 1890s. And then in the 20th century, things begin to change dramatically. They, of course, wrote letters. There's a whole series of things that they did write, posters, all kinds of stuff, which simply hasn't survived. But here I picked out 8 very interesting observations, interesting things that can be described as being Chinese voices. Some are written in Chinese, some are written in English, some are written with the European audience in mind, others are written simply for personal purposes. But they give a good example. And as usual, how AI people can be dependent upon to discuss this in their usually enthusiastic way. So I'll let you enjoy that. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing something a little different. We're going deep into Chinese Australian history, but not through the usual sources. No, we're looking at writing by Chinese Australians themselves.
Yeah, so it's like hearing history straight from the source, getting their perspective rather than always relying on European observations.
Exactly. And the range of stuff we've got is incredible. We're talking a shepherd's murder defense from the 1850s, a novel that takes on some huge social issues, even poems carved right into sandstone walls.
It's really about understanding how these Chinese Australians carved out a place for themselves, through legal battles, sure,
Yeah.
but also through things like literature and just expressing their thoughts and feelings.
Let's start with that murder defense, shall we?
Mm-hmm.
This is from the 1850s, and it was created by a shepherd named Ang. Well, you guessed it, he couldn't speak English very well.
Yeah, so his defense is a drawing a mix of words and sketches, which is pretty unique, and it's likely the earliest piece of Chinese writing we have in Australia.
It's like a silent film, right?
Yeah.
Capturing this moment in time, you see figures herding sheep, then there's an altercation, someone falls. It's tragic.
But there's more to it than that. It's an act of defiance, really. Aang couldn't communicate in English, so he chose to show his story visually.
It makes you wonder how many other stories we've lost simply because they weren't recorded in English,
Exactly. These sources push us to look beyond the usual records and consider alternative ways of telling history.
Okay, let's jump ahead to 1932 and talk about Vivian Young Chow. He's a writer born in Lismore, and he wrote this short story called What Happened to Riley?
What's remarkable is this story predates other examples of Chinese Australian literature in English by decades.
And it takes on Western perceptions of Chinese Australians in a big way. It centers on this confrontation between a Chinese Australian and a European Australian, all set in warlord-era China.
And Chow even directly addresses these stereotypes in the story. He writes, a humble, meek, ignorant fellow soaked with opium and mad upon gambling, a clean-minded, clean-bodied, active-brained Chinese spells the doom of a white world dominion.
It's like he's saying we're more than the limited roles you've given us,
Right, it's reframing the narrative completely.
Yeah.
Chow's not just telling a story, he's actively challenging harmful stereotypes and presenting a much more nuanced view of Chinese Australian identity.
And this was decades before these themes became more common in literature.
Exactly. He was a pioneer paving the way for future writers to explore their own identities and experiences.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about poetry carved into sandstone walls.
Yeah.
This was found at Sydney's North Head Quarantine Station, which was operating until 1984.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the isolation many faced, when they first arrived. But the carvings are more than just expressions of hardship.
So what are they?
Acts of defiance, I'd say, in a space where their voices were often suppressed. One carving reads, "As soon as thinking of my younger brother without help, I set off for Gold Mountain right away. Occasionally, a man died of smallpox."
Wow, it gives you a sense of the sacrifices they made, the risks they took, all those emotions.
And remember, these carvings were made in a place of confinement, so Right. Etching those thoughts onto the walls was a way of reclaiming some agency, asserting their presence.
It adds another layer of meaning, doesn't it? Like a subtle form of resistance.
Exactly. And there's even one carving denouncing a specific Englishman, which suggests personal encounters with prejudice.
So these weren't just personal reflections. They were documenting their experiences, frustrations, even anger.
Yeah, it speaks to the human need to express oneself even in the toughest situations.
There's one more carving we need to talk about. It's a bilingual inscription commemorating the quarantine of the steamship St. Albans back in 1917.
The choice to use both English and Chinese is fascinating. It speaks to the layered history of the site, right? A place where different communities interacted and where these Chinese Australians asserted themselves through language.
It's like saying, we're here, and our language, our culture is part of this place.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful way of claiming their place in Australian history.
Now imagine this. You get a letter from a relative, but instead of just catching up, it's a plea for financial help.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's what we have in a letter written by Lao Gai Chiang to his brother-in-law, Sun Kai, in the early 20th century.
This letter really highlights the whole sojourner experience, right? Coming to a new country to work, but with the intention of eventually returning home.
And the pressure they face to support families both here and back in China.
Right.
And Lao Gai Chiang's words are just heartbreaking. He talks about his struggles with arthritis, his inability to work, and how he relies on meager earnings as a peddler.
Oh, wow.
He even writes, "This is not enough for my own mother or to look after my wife, and I don't want to live and don't want to die either."
You can feel his desperation. It's not just a request for help, it's a glimpse into the emotional and financial burdens they carried.
It shows how interconnected these families were across continents. The decisions made by those who left had huge consequences for those back in China.
It's a reminder that migration isn't just an individual thing, it's a collective experience with consequences that reach across borders and generations.
So we've got a murder defense, a story challenging stereotypes, poetry etched in stone, and a heartbreaking plea for help. What else is hidden in these Chinese voices? 8 sources.
Well, there's a novel that tackles a big social issue that was hugely relevant to the Chinese community at the time, polygamy.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the poison of polygamy. So this poison of polygamy you mentioned, tell me more about this novel.
Well, it was written in classical Chinese by Wong Shee Ping, and it was actually serialized in Melbourne's Chinese Times newspaper from 1909 to 1910. And what makes it so fascinating is it really tackles this practice of polygamy head on. It follows this guy, Wang Shonghong, and his journey as a sojourner. He eventually finds success in Australia and returns to his wife in China.
I see. So it's more than just one man's story, right? It speaks to these complexities and contradictions of a community grappling with tradition and change in this new environment.
Exactly. Wang Shee Ping uses the seemingly simple story to explore all these moral dilemmas and societal consequences of polygamy, particularly its impact on the women who were left behind in China. Remember, this was a time when many Chinese men came to Australia intending to return home eventually.
But polygamy added another layer to that dynamic, right?
Absolutely. And the novel doesn't shy away from those difficult conversations. It exposes the tensions between upholding those traditions and adapting to this new world. And it also reveals anxieties around maintaining family ties across continents and negotiating these changing gender roles.
And the fact that it was serialized in a newspaper suggests that these were topics being widely discussed and debated within the Chinese-Australian community at the time.
That's a great point. Serializing it meant it reached a much wider audience. It probably fueled conversations about these complex social issues and maybe even influenced personal choices and community norms.
It's also interesting that Wong Shee Ping wasn't just any writer, right? He was the son of a gold digger and a successful Melbourne businessman. He was deeply embedded in this community.
And he was a staunch Republican, too. Writing at a time when China itself was going through huge political and social transformation. So his perspective likely resonated with those who saw the need for change, both within their community and back in their homeland.
So that makes his critique of polygamy even more powerful.
Yeah.
Right? He's not an outsider looking in. He's part of the community challenging its practices from within.
His novel reminds us that progress often comes from confronting uncomfortable truths and having those open dialogues even within your own community.
Okay, so we've got a novel challenging these traditional practices. Now, let's talk about someone who chose to make Australia his permanent home. What can you tell me about Tam Se Pui and his bilingual autobiography, My Life and Work?
Yeah, Tam Se Pui's story is a classic example of resilience and adaptation, like so many others. He arrived in Australia with dreams of striking it rich on the goldfields, but reality hit pretty quickly.
I can imagine the gold rush wasn't the easy path to riches many had hoped for.
No, not at all. But Tam Se Pui didn't give up. He took on all sorts of jobs, from vegetable gardening to domestic service. It shows how adaptable many Chinese Australians were in seeking out new
It
opportunities.
speaks to that willingness to work hard and persevere, even when things get tough.
And throughout his struggles, Tom Sipui never forgot his family back in China. He consistently sent remittances back home, supporting them financially and demonstrating the strong family bonds that were so important to the Chinese diaspora. He even played a role in arranging his brother's marriage and return to China.
So he's balancing those obligations to his family in China with his desire to build a new life for himself in Australia.
Right, and that's where his decision to have a wife sent from China becomes really interesting. It signifies his intention to put down roots in Australia while maintaining those ties to his home village.
It's like blending two worlds, a real testament to the complexities of navigating identity and belonging in this migrant context.
His story really encapsulates so many aspects of the Chinese-Australian experience. It's got those themes of family economic hardship, entrepreneurship, and the constant pull between two cultures.
And the fact that his autobiography was written in both English and Chinese speaks volumes about the importance of language right in preserving that cultural heritage and bridging the gap between those two worlds.
It's a powerful statement about the multifaceted nature of identity. Tom Sipui was both Chinese and Australian, and his story shows how fluid and dynamic cultural identity can be in a migrant context.
Speaking of navigating complex social landscapes, our next source highlights a collective response to this rising tide of anti-Chinese sentiment in Australia.
You're talking about the Chinese question in Australia, right? This pamphlet was published in 1878 by three prominent Chinese Australian businessmen, El Kong Meng Chek, Hong Chong, and Luia Mui.
And this wasn't just a complaint. This is a sophisticated piece of advocacy, meticulously crafted to address and dismantle the very arguments being used against Chinese immigration.
Yeah, they brilliantly expose the hypocrisy of it all, reminding Australians that it was British colonial expansion that forced China to open its borders to trade and migration in the first place.
And now these Australian colonies were trying to deny Chinese people the same freedoms and opportunities that they themselves enjoyed. The irony is incredible.
And they didn't stop there. They highlighted the vital contributions of Chinese residents to the Australian economy, emphasizing their roles as hardworking business owners, taxpayers, employers of local labor.
They were basically saying that restricting Chinese immigration would hurt not only the Chinese community, but Australian society as a whole.
And they presented their arguments so eloquently, appealing to reasoned justice. Even those shared values of British colonialism, they understood their audience and tailored their message perfectly.
It's a testament to their courage and intellect, refusing to be silenced in the face of prejudice and using their voices to advocate for a more just and equitable society.
It's a reminder that silence is never the answer when faced with injustice. You have to speak up, challenge those harmful narratives, and fight for a better future.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a source that really captures that sojourner experience visually, the drawing by Ang, the shepherd accused of manslaughter back in 1850.
Ah, yes. Ang's case, remember, his spoken and written language were very limited, so he relied on this incredible visual defense to communicate his side of the story.
It's like a time capsule. Through his drawings, we get a glimpse of life on the Australian frontier, those harsh conditions, the cultural clashes, and those tragic events that unfolded.
It's amazing that this drawing, which is likely one of the earliest pieces of Chinese writing in Australia, acts as this bridge between two cultures. Ang used his art to communicate across that language barrier. It really shows the power of visual storytelling.
It's a testament to his ingenuity and resilience. He didn't let his limited English silence him. He found a creative way to make his voice heard.
Ang's drawing, just like all these other Chinese Voices 8 sources, reveals the complexity of Chinese Australian history. They offer us a window into the lives of these individuals who challenged norms, navigated these complex social situations, and ultimately contributed to Australian society.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. We've explored a range of fascinating sources, each with its own unique perspective on the Chinese-Australian experience.
But our journey's not over yet. In part 3, we'll delve even deeper into those themes of belonging, identity, and the legacies of colonialism, exploring how these voices from the past still resonate with us today.
Welcome back to our final deep dive into these incredible Chinese Voices 8 sources. It's amazing how these personal stories, really reveal those broader historical truths.
Yeah, definitely. These voices give us a unique perspective on themes that are still so relevant today. Things like belonging identity and the lasting impact of colonialism. They remind us that history isn't just dates and events, it's about real people living through those complex social and political forces.
Let's go back to the poison of polygamy for a second. It's more than just a morality tale, isn't it? It gives us this insight into how the Chinese Australian community viewed traditions like polygamy in this completely new context.
Exactly. Remember Wong Shee Ping, the author? He was deeply connected to the community. He understood what it meant to be a sojourner, that pull between two worlds, and how tough it was to reconcile those cultural practices with life in Australia.
And by critiquing polygamy, he really sparked a conversation about its impact on families, especially women, during a time of such huge change in both Australia and China.
It reminds us that even within a community, there are diverse perspectives and ongoing discussions about cultural norms and values. Migration often really accelerates those conversations as people adapt to new environments and reevaluate their traditions.
So Wang Shiping was challenging the status quo from within, pushing his community to evolve and adapt.
Right.
Now, in contrast, Tom CP, the author of My Life and Work, represents someone who successfully integrated into Australian society while still holding on to his Chinese heritage.
Yeah, Tom Sepui's story is a fantastic example of resilience in creating a hybrid identity. He faced the same hardships as many others, discrimination and economic struggles, that longing for home, yet he chose to build a life in Australia, bridging those two cultures.
His decision to have a wife sent from China was particularly interesting. It shows his desire to establish a family and create a future in Australia while still honoring his Chinese heritage and family obligations.
And don't forget, he wrote his autobiography in both English and Chinese. That act signifies the importance of language in preserving cultural identity, but also embracing a new language and a new home. It speaks to the richness and complexity of navigating those multiple cultural identities.
His story really shows us that there's no single immigrant experience, right? Everyone charts their own path, making choices that reflect their own values, aspirations, and circumstances.
Absolutely. And the Chinese question in Australia really demonstrates a collective response to that growing anti-Chinese sentiment. It highlights the power of advocacy and speaking truth to power.
That pamphlet, published by those three successful Chinese-Australian businessmen, was a bold act of defiance. They didn't just accept the discrimination they were facing, they challenged it head-on, using logic and reason to dismantle those racist arguments.
Yes. Yeah, they really exposed the hypocrisy of those British colonial policies. The ones that forced China to open up to trade and migration while simultaneously trying to restrict the movement and opportunities of Chinese people in Australia. It was a brave move, and it shows their understanding of the political landscape and their determination to fight for their rights.
And they were so effective in articulating the contributions of the Chinese community to the economy, highlighting their roles as business owners, taxpayers, employers. They understood that appealing to economic self-interest was a powerful way to influence people.
It wasn't just a complaint, it was a call for justice, a demand for recognition, and a testament to the resilience of a community determined to shape its own future.
Their words still resonate today, reminding us that the fight against racism and discrimination is never truly over. It takes courage, strategic thinking, and a willingness to speak truth to power.
And finally, we come back to Aang's visual murder defense. It's such a powerful metaphor for the broader themes we've been discussing.
Here's a man facing a serious charge, unable to effectively communicate in English, yet he finds a way to tell his story, to have his voice heard through the power of visual communication.
Those drawings are more than just a legal defense. They represent human ingenuity and that basic need we all have to express ourselves no matter how difficult the situation. They challenge us to think about how we interpret history and to value different forms of expression beyond just the written word.
Aang's story, like all the voices we've encountered in these Chinese Disraeli voices, encourages us to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface, and recognize the richness and complexity of the Chinese-Australian experience.
They challenge us to question those traditional historical narratives, to acknowledge the contributions and resilience of marginalized communities, and to understand how the past continues to shape the present.
It's been an incredible journey exploring these sources, and I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to learn more. The more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to create a more inclusive and just future for everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, as usual, a very interesting discussion by AI bots. And as usual, at the end, they talk about needing to look at history in a different way. This is, of course, a cliche that is built into the bots, and they kind of end off most of the discussions of history in that way, but I always leave it in because I think I actually agree with it. Of course, you should always be looking at history from different perspectives, and this is what looking at things from this Chinese voices in particular is meant to do. They're not going to give you a deep overview of all of Chinese Australian history, but they do give you enough 8 different examples of how people saw things in different ways, from different angles, different individuals, some political, some personal, some emotional, even poetic. And I think this is very interesting. If you want to purchase the book, get a bit more detail, then go onto the Child Study Press website, order the book, or as usual, write to Child Study Press at gmail.com. All this information you can see on the Podbean or other podcast information. Write to me if you want more information, if you wish to purchase this or any other publications. And once again, thank you very much for your listening, and enjoy.